The crowd was standing. Thousands of people clapping, shouting, screaming his name. From the outside, it looked like another perfect Elvis Presley moment. But standing under those lights, Elvis felt something that terrified him more than silence. He felt nothing. Stay with us until the end, because this story reveals the exact moment Elvis Presley realized that the applause he had chased for years might no longer be reaching him at all. The lights hit first. They always did. Blinding, unforgiving, turning the world into heat and color and expectation. Elvis stepped forward as the band struck the opening notes, and the crowd responded instantly, a wave of sound rising to meet him. Applause, screams. His name, shouted from every direction. It should have felt familiar. It should have felt powerful. Instead, Elvis felt strangely distant, as if the sound stopped just short where he stood. He moved automatically, every gesture precise, practiced over years of repetition. The stance, the timing, the way he leaned into the microphone, the way the audience leaned back. From the outside, nothing was wrong. From the inside, something was missing. As the first song ended, the applause crashed over him again, louder than before. People stood, clapped, reached out toward the stage. Elvis smiled when expected, nodding in acknowledgement. But the smile didn't reach his chest. He waited for the familiar surge, that brief, electric moment when the noise became fuel. It didn't come. Instead, there was a pause inside him. Not confusion. Not panic. Emptiness. Elvis glanced toward the band, catching the drummer's eye for a fraction of a second. Everything was in sync. The show was flawless. No technical problems. No mistakes. That made it worse, because there was nothing to blame. He launched into the next song, his voice strong, controlled, exactly as it should be. The audience responded enthusiastically, every note rewarded with cheers. But Elvis felt like he was singing at them, not with them. As the set continued, the realization crept in slowly, quietly, the way uncomfortable truths often do. The applause wasn't for him. It was for the idea of him, for the memory people carried, for the comfort his presence represented, for the version of Elvis that lived in their minds. Standing there, drenched in light and sound, Elvis understood something that unsettled him deeply. He could stop feeling, and the show would go on anyway. The thought followed him into the next song, then the next. His body performed perfectly while his mind drifted elsewhere, observing himself from a distance. He watched the way the crowd reacted on cue, the way certain moves triggered predictable waves of sound, the way applause arrived regardless of what he felt in that moment. That's when it hit him. The applause wasn't responding to him anymore. It was responding to the role. Elvis finished the song and stood still as the noise swelled again, louder than ever. He nodded once, lifting his hand slightly in acknowledgement. Inside, the silence was deafening. For the first time in his career, Elvis realized the most frightening possibility of all. He could disappear emotionally, and no one would notice. And standing there, under the roar of thousands, Elvis Presley faced a truth he had never allowed himself to consider before. Being loved by a crowd didn't mean being felt. Elvis tried to pull himself back in. That was his instinct, not a retreat, not to stop, but to reach. He had done it 1,000 times before. When energy dipped, when a room shifted, when something felt slightly off, he knew how to adjust. He knew how to lean in. So he did. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, narrowing the distance between himself and the front rows. Faces came into focus. Wide eyes, open mouths, hands stretched upward, as if proximity alone might complete something inside them. Elvis sang directly to them. He softened his delivery, letting the lyrics breathe, adding small pauses where emotion usually lived. He watched for reactions, the moment when a face changes, when someone stops cheering long enough to listen. The response was immediate. The crowd erupted. Applause surged again, louder, more urgent, as if his closeness had unlocked something they were waiting for. People screamed his name. Cameras flashed. Hands reached even higher. And still, nothing shifted inside him. That was when panic brushed past him for the first time. Not sharp, not overwhelming. Just enough to make him aware of it. Elvis straightened and moved back toward center stage, his heart beating a little faster now. He changed songs, switching to something more familiar, something guaranteed. The band followed without hesitation, perfectly attuned to his cues. The crowd sang along, thousands of voices moving in unison, filling the space where his own connection used to live. Elvis listened to them sing his words back to him and felt an unexpected detachment settle in. It sounded beautiful, powerful, alive, but it wasn't reaching him. He realized then that the applause wasn't failing. He was not in ability, not in professionalism, in presence. He had been performing for so long that somewhere along the way, the stage had stopped being a place of exchange and become a place of output. He gave. They received. They responded. The cycle continued. What was missing was him, the man behind the movement, the feeling behind the sound. Elvis felt a sudden urge to stop the music, to say something unscripted, to break the rhythm and remind himself and them that there was a person standing there, not just a symbol. But the thought froze halfway. He knew the risk. Anything unscripted would be interpreted, analyzed, absorbed into the story people already believed about him. Even vulnerability had become part of the image. He sang on. Each song felt like walking farther from a door he could no longer see. The crowd stayed with him every step of the way, enthusiastic and unwavering. That constancy should have comforted him. Instead, it frightened him, because it meant the applause didn't depend on his inner state at all. He could be fully present or completely absent, and the sound would be the same. As the set pushed forward, Elvis caught his reflection briefly in a darkened monitor at the side of the stage. The image moved perfectly in time with the music. It looked convincing. It looked complete. And for the first time, Elvis wondered if the version of himself the audience loved had quietly learned how to exist without him inside it. That realization stayed with him as he finished the song, the applause rising again on cue. From the outside, it sounded like love. From the inside, it felt like distance. And Elvis understood then that trying harder wasn't going to fix it, because the problem wasn't effort. It was connection, and he no longer knew where to find it. The show moved towards conclusion the way it always did. Efficiently, predictably unstoppable. Elvis could feel it in the pacing, in the way the band transitioned between songs without needing direction, in the way the crowd seemed to anticipate every move before he made it. Even the pauses felt rehearsed, filled perfectly by cheers that arrived right on time. He stood center stage, microphone warm in his hand, and let the final notes of the song hang in the air a fraction longer than necessary. The applause exploded. People were on their feet now. Some clapped above their heads. Some screamed until their voices cracked. Others simply stared, tears on their faces, as if witnessing something sacred. Elvis bowed his head slightly. He felt nothing, not disappointment, not anger. A strange calm settled over him instead, the calm that comes when a realization finishes forming. He stopped searching the crowd. That in itself felt like a surrender. As the applause continued, Elvis noticed how it began to blur into a single, sustained sound. Individual voices disappeared. Faces lost distinction. The crowd became a force rather than a collection of people. Powerful, impersonal. He remembered a time when applause had felt like conversation. When a cheer here, a hush there, a held breath before a note felt like dialogue. When he could sense the room responding not just to what he did, but to how he felt while doing it. This wasn't that. This was confirmation. The applause wasn't asking anything of him anymore. It didn't need him to be present. It needed him to exist. Elvis took a step back, letting the band play on without him for a moment. The crowd didn't notice. The sound didn't dip. The energy didn't change. That was when it fully settled in. He could walk off the stage, emotionally, and the performance would still be considered perfect. The idea didn't make him want to leave. It made him want to understand. He returned to the microphone and spoke a few closing words. The familiar phrases, delivered with warmth and gratitude. The audience responded exactly as expected, hanging on every syllable. Elvis smiled. The smile was real, but it was detached. As the final bow approached, he glanced once more across the sea of faces. Not looking for connection this time, but confirmation of what he already knew. He found it. The applause was unwavering. And for the first time, That consistency felt like a warning instead of reassurance. When the lights dimmed and the band struck the last chord, the sound reached its peak. Elvis waved once, then turned and walked toward the wings. The moment his foot crossed offstage, the noise dropped slightly, as if the room itself exhaled. Backstage was darker, cooler, quieter. Elvis stopped just beyond the curtain and stood there, listening to the applause continue without him fully visible. It kept going, longer than usual. He waited for familiar relief to arrive, that sense of completion of a job well done. It didn't. Instead, a single thought rose quietly in its place. If this doesn't reach me anymore, what happens next? Elvis walked farther down the corridor, away from the sound, letting it fade gradually behind him. With every step, the applause became less distinct, less commanding, until it was just another noise in a building full of them. For the first time in his career, Elvis realized he was waiting for the applause to end, not because he disliked it, but because he needed to hear what came after. And as the noise finally softened into memory, Elvis understood that the silence waiting on the other side wasn't empty. It was full of questions he could no longer ignore. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. For a moment, Elvis stood still in the dressing room, hand resting on the handle, as if he might open it again and step back into the noise. The applause was still audible through the walls, muffled now, distant but persistent. He didn't move. The room was lit warmly, almost gently, the kind of light meant to comfort after intensity. A mirror lined with bulbs reflected his image back at him from multiple angles. Costumes hung neatly where they had been placed hours earlier, untouched since the show began. Everything was exactly as it should be. That was the problem. Elvis walked toward the mirror and stopped a few feet away, not close enough to study himself, not far enough to avoid the reflection entirely. He loosened his collar and let his shoulders drop slightly, feeling the weight of the night settle into his body. This was usually the moment he enjoyed. The exhale after effort, the quiet pride, the sense of having delivered something meaningful. Tonight, there was only stillness. He sat down slowly on the couch, elbows resting on his knees, hands hanging loosely between them. The applause outside began to fade in waves, rising briefly, then falling away again. He listened carefully, not for praise, for change. There wasn't any. Elvis realized then that the silence in the room felt louder than the roar outside ever had. It pressed in around him, exposing something he hadn't wanted to name on stage. He felt untouched, not physically, emotionally. The performance had passed through him without leaving a mark. That thought scared him more than exhaustion ever had. A knock came at the door. "Elvis," a voice called. "Great show." He didn't answer right away. Another knock, softer this time. "You want company?" Elvis looked around the room, at the carefully arranged evidence of a life that kept moving regardless of how he felt inside it. "No," he said finally. "I'm all right." The footsteps retreated. Alone again, Elvis leaned back against the cushions and stared at the ceiling. He traced a faint crack with his eyes, following it from one corner toward the center, the way he sometimes followed melodies when words felt unnecessary. He thought about how many times he relied on the stage to tell him who he was, how often applause had been proof, not of success, but of existence. If people responded, he mattered. If they listened, he was present. Tonight had broken that equation. They had responded loudly, and he had felt absent. Elvis sat up and rubbed his hands together slowly, grounding himself in the sensation. The room smelled faintly of sweat and cologne, reminders that he had been working, moving, giving. Yet nothing inside him felt spent. That was new. He realized then that he had crossed into dangerous territory. Not failure, but numbness. The kind that doesn't announce itself. That doesn't collapse you. That simply allows you to continue, without fully participating. He stood again and approached the mirror, this time stepping closer. The reflection met him easily, confidently. The face was composed, successful, familiar to millions. Elvis searched it for something. Anger, sadness, relief. None of it surfaced. Instead, he felt distance. The applause outside finally faded completely, replaced by the ordinary sounds of the building shifting back into routine. Doors opening. Voices drifting away. Another night ending. Elvis rested his palm against the mirror for a moment, feeling the cool glass beneath his skin. "If this doesn't reach me anymore," he said quietly, testing the words aloud, "what am I supposed to listen to?" The question hung in the room unanswered. He didn't expect one. What he felt instead was resolve. Not dramatic, not loud, but firm. A recognition that something would have to change, even if he didn't yet know how. Because if he kept going like this, the applause would continue, and he would disappear inside it. Elvis turned away from the mirror and reached for a jacket, slipping it on without ceremony. The night outside the dressing room was waiting, ordinary and unremarkable. But for him, it felt like the beginning of a conversation he could no longer avoid. The show was over. The silence had arrived. And Elvis knew now that the real work was just beginning, not on stage, but in the quiet spaces where no one was clapping to remind him who he was supposed to be. Elvis didn't leave immediately. He stood in the hallway outside the dressing room for a moment, listening to the building settle into itself. The night staff moved quietly now, efficient and invisible, dismantling what felt monumental only an hour earlier. Cables were coiled, doors closed, voices lowered. The world knew how to move on. Elvis stepped forward and began walking, not toward the exit he usually used, but down a side corridor that led away from the center of attention. His footsteps echoed softly, the sound oddly grounding. For the first time that night, he felt present in his own body. The applause was gone. That should have felt like loss. Instead, it felt like relief. Outside, the air was cooler, sharper, cutting through the residual heat of the stage. Elvis inhaled deeply, letting the night fill his lungs. The parking lot was mostly empty now, the glow of streetlights reflecting off polished surfaces and asphalt. He leaned against the car without opening the door, staring at nothing in particular. This was usually the moment where satisfaction arrived, the delayed echo of success, the knowledge that he had done what was expected, delivered what was promised. It didn't come. What came instead was a quiet honesty he hadn't invited, but couldn't push away. The applause had not lied to him. It had simply stopped telling the whole truth. It told him he was admired. It told him he was wanted. It told him he was familiar. What it no longer told him was whether he was felt. Elvis realized how dangerous it was to confuse volume with connection, how easy it had been to assume that loud meant meaningful, that repetition meant intimacy. Tonight had stripped that illusion away. He slid into back seat and closed the door, the soft thud sealing him into a quieter world. The car pulled away slowly, city lights passing by in long, uninterrupted lines. He watched his reflection appear and disappear in the window glass, layered over streets he'd traveled countless times before. For once, he wasn't thinking about the next show. He was thinking about the space between shows, the hours where he was expected to recover, reset, become ready again, without ever asking what he was recovering from. Elvis rested his head back and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen inwardly. The silence wasn't empty now. It carried weight, direction, possibility. He understood then that the problem wasn't that the applause had stopped reaching him. It was that he had stopped reaching himself. That realization didn't come with answers, but it came with responsibility. Responsibility to find a way back. Not to the crowd, but to the feeling that had once made the crowd matter. The car slowed as they approached his destination. Elvis straightened slightly, preparing to re-enter a world that would continue asking things of him without hesitation. But something inside him had shifted. He would still walk onto stages, still hear the applause, still play the role, but he would no longer mistake noise for connection. As the car came to a stop, Elvis reached for the door handle, pausing briefly before opening it. In that pause lived a promise, not spoken, not dramatic, but real. The next time he stepped onto a stage, he wouldn't be listening for applause. He would be listening for himself. And if he couldn't hear that, no matter how loud the crowd became, he knew it would be time to ask harder questions than any audience ever could. The door opened. The night welcomed him back quietly. And for the first time, Elvis felt less afraid of the silence than he did of the noise he had been hiding inside. Elvis didn't talk about that night afterward. There was no moment where he named it, no conversation where he pointed to it and said, "That's when things changed." From the outside, Everything continued exactly as it always had. Shows sold out. Reviews praised him. The machine kept moving forward, smooth and unquestioning. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The next time Elvis stepped onto a stage, the applause arrived right on cue. Loud, eager, familiar. For a brief moment, muscle memory tried to pull him back into the old rhythm. The nod, the smile, the internal calculation of how much energy the crowd needed and when. Then he stopped himself. Not physically, internally. He let the sound exist without chasing it. And that was when he realized the applause no longer controlled him the way it once had. It still mattered. It still moved him. But it no longer defined him. Elvis began to notice something subtle in the weeks that followed. The silence after shows didn't feel as threatening. Dressing rooms became places to sit instead of escape. Long car rides no longer demanded constant noise to fill them. He wasn't happier. He was clearer. That distinction mattered. The moment he realized the applause wasn't for him anymore had forced him to confront a truth he'd avoided for years. Connection couldn't be outsourced to crowds. Identity couldn't be maintained through reaction alone. If he wanted to feel present again, it wouldn't come from louder rooms or bigger moments. It would come from attention, from listening to himself before listening to the noise around him. One night, after another flawless performance, Elvis stood just off stage and waited, not for the applause to swell, but for it to fade. He watched it rise and fall like weather, powerful, impressive, temporary. When it was gone, he remained, and that was the test. He felt grounded, still tired, still carrying the weight of expectation, but no longer hollow. Elvis understood then that the danger had never been the applause itself. It was mistaking it for proof of life. That realization didn't save him from struggle. It didn't rewrite the future or soften the years ahead. But it gave him something rare and essential, a boundary between who he was and how he was received. From that night on, Elvis stopped asking the crowd to tell him who he was. He already knew what happened when they did. The applause could be thunderous. It could be endless. But it could never replace presence. And standing there, in the quiet after the noise had done its work, Elvis Presley understood something that no amount of love from a crowd could teach him. You don't disappear when the applause ends. You disappear when you stop listening to yourself while it's happening. That night didn't mark the end of anything visible, but it marked the beginning of a private shift, one that would follow him long after the lights dimmed, reminding him that even legends have to decide where their sense of self actually lives. Not in the sound, but in the silence they're finally brave enough to hear.